The sound of screeching tires and shattering glass still echoed in Ethan Crawford's mind, even days after the accident. He couldn't move without feeling the sharp reminder of his broken bones. Every breath a painful reminder of how close he had come to losing it all. The accident had left him trapped in his mansion, his body confined to a bed, completely dependent on others. For someone like Ethan, a man used to having control over every aspect of his life, this was nothing short of torture. The once bustling, glamorous life he led came to a sudden halt. Ethan Crawford, the millionaire bachelor, known for his powerful business acumen and social status, was now a prisoner in his own home. The vast halls of his mansion, filled with silence, felt oppressive rather than comforting. As much as he hated it, he couldn't deny the truth. He needed help. His assistant, Grace, had been the one to hire the caretaker. "She's highly recommended," Grace had said, her voice firm but tinged with concern. "You'll like her." Ethan had barely listened. He had bigger problems to deal with, like the unbearable frustration gnawing at him from within. But when the door creaked open and she walked in, something inside him shifted. "Mr. Crawford? My name is Emily Harper," she said, stepping into the room with a calm, almost soothing presence. Her eyes, a soft shade of hazel, were steady, and there was an immediate ease in the way she moved. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter under the weight of the mansion's grandeur or Ethan's intimidating gaze. Ethan stared at her longer than he intended. She was different. There was something unsettlingly familiar about her, but he couldn't place it. "Just Ethan," he muttered, trying to shake off the strange feeling. "No need for formalities." Emily nodded, a small, professional smile playing on her lips as she approached the side of his bed. Her hands were gentle but firm as she began her work, adjusting his pillows, checking the medications, and assessing his injuries. She didn't fumble or stumble. Everything about her was deliberate, controlled. For Ethan, it was like watching someone who had been in his life forever, though he knew they had never met before. As she worked, he couldn't shake the sense of déjà vu that prickled the back of his mind. Something about her reminded him of someone, something buried deep in the recesses of his memory, but before he could grasp it, the thought slipped away. "You're quiet," Emily remarked after a long pause, her tone light but respectful. "Usually, people complain more when they're in your condition." Ethan smirked, though the expression barely lifted the corners of his mouth. "I'm not most people." "I can see that," Emily said, not missing a beat, her eyes glinting with subtle humor. There was something refreshing about her demeanor, something that cut through the haze of pain and frustration. Most people either treated him like he was fragile or, worse, pitied him. Emily, however, seemed to look at him like a person. The days began to blur after her arrival, but the routine that once felt suffocating started to change. Emily was efficient and practical, yet there was a warmth to her that Ethan found disarming. She didn't press him with questions, didn't pry into his life like so many others did. Instead, she let the silence between them breathe, only speaking when necessary, yet always listening when he did. Still, that gnawing feeling of familiarity lingered in his thoughts, slowly growing into something Ethan could no longer ignore. He watched her carefully, his mind racing to piece together where he might have seen her before. Maybe it was just the painkillers messing with his head, or the isolation of being bedridden for so long, but the feeling wouldn't go away. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Ethan found himself asking her, "Have we met before?" Emily paused, her hands stilling as she rearranged the tray on his bedside table. She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, but then she smiled. "I don't think so," she replied smoothly. "I've lived a pretty quiet life until now." Ethan's brow furrowed. He wasn't satisfied with that answer, but he couldn't explain why. He let it go, for now, but the question lingered in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. As the days passed, Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing connection to her, something deeper than mere gratitude for her care. It was strange. He, of all people, knew how to keep people at a distance, to build walls that no one could break through. And yet, here she was, slowly slipping through the cracks, becoming a part of his life in a way that both intrigued and unnerved him. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that the past was not as far away as they thought. The secrets buried in their histories were about to surface, and when they did, nothing between them would ever be the same. The soft murmur of rain against the windows filled the quiet mansion as Emily moved efficiently through the room, organizing medications and adjusting Ethan's schedule for the week. She was calm, almost methodical, and yet there was something about her presence that seemed to alter the atmosphere of the place. It was no longer the suffocating silence that had plagued Ethan since his accident. Instead, there was a strange sense of peace. Or maybe it was just that Emily had an innate ability to fade into the background, giving him space to breathe. For Ethan, though, she wasn't so easy to forget. Since their first conversation, the sense of familiarity had grown stronger, gnawing at him whenever she was near. Every glance she gave him, every small smile, only deepened the mystery that surrounded her. He couldn't shake the feeling that he knew her from somewhere, but every time he asked himself where, the answer slipped away like sand between his fingers. "You're lost in thought again," Emily's voice broke through his contemplation. She was sitting by his bedside, organizing his evening medication. "Is everything all right?" Ethan blinked, snapping out of his daze. He wasn't used to people calling him out on his moods. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She nodded but didn't pry further. It was something Ethan appreciated about her. She didn't bombard him with sympathy or unnecessary concern. She just was. And yet, he wanted to know more about her, to understand why this quiet, unassuming woman made him feel so unbalanced. "Emily," he said slowly, catching her attention as she prepared to leave the room, "how long have you been doing this?" "This?" she asked, pausing at the door, her hand resting lightly on the frame. "You mean caregiving?" "Yeah," he replied, trying to make it sound like idle curiosity, though the intensity in his voice betrayed him. "You're good at it." A soft smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you. It's been a few years now, ever since I decided to help people who need it." Her answer was vague, but Ethan didn't miss the hesitation in her voice, the way her eyes flickered with something unspoken. There was a story behind those words, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to dig into it. Not yet, anyway. Ethan shifted in his bed, grimacing as a sharp pain shot through his leg. Emily immediately moved toward him, adjusting his position with gentle, practiced hands. "Easy," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "Don't push yourself." He hated feeling this weak, this dependent, but somehow, Emily's touch didn't feel patronizing or pitying. It felt natural. The familiarity crept back in, stronger than before, and Ethan found himself staring at her again, wondering why she made him feel like he was forgetting something important. "Emily," he started, his voice quieter now, "have you ever worked for someone like me before?" She froze for a split second, but recovered quickly, smiling softly as she finished adjusting his blanket. "I've worked for many people, Ethan. Everyone is different in their own way." Her response was vague again, but there was something in the way she said it that made Ethan's stomach tighten. He was about to press further when Grace, his assistant, entered the room, interrupting the moment. "Ethan," Grace began, holding a folder filled with documents. "We need to go over the company's quarterly reports. I know you're still recovering, but there are some urgent decisions that need your approval." Ethan sighed, the weight of responsibility crashing back down on him. Before the accident, business had been his entire life. Now, it felt like a distant memory, something that didn't matter as much anymore. But he knew better than to let things slip through his fingers. "All right," he said, forcing himself to sit up straighter. "Give me the rundown." Grace went on, her voice droning through the financial details, but Ethan's mind wandered back to Emily, who had quietly stepped out of the room. There was something about her, something more than just her calm professionalism. As Grace continued her update, Ethan's thoughts returned to that moment of hesitation in Emily's response, and that feeling he couldn't shake, that Emily Harper was much more than just a stranger. Later that night, long after Grace had left and the mansion had fallen into its usual silence, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the events of the day, focusing again on Emily. Why did it feel like he had known her for longer than just a few weeks? He wasn't a man who believed in coincidences, and the way his gut churned every time he saw her told him this wasn't just his imagination running wild. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. He had grown up in a strict, wealthy household, where emotions were often buried beneath layers of expectation and tradition. But there had been a time, a brief, fleeting time, when there had been laughter and the warmth of family had been real. He remembered a girl, a friend, maybe someone important, but the memory was so hazy, so distant, that it almost felt like a dream. Could Emily be connected to that? No, it was impossible. He was being irrational, letting his injury and the isolation play tricks on him. Still, the feeling persisted. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, it was filled with fragmented dreams. A house, a family, a girl's laughter echoing in the distance. He could never quite see her face, but the sound of her voice lingered, haunting him even as he drifted deeper into the darkness of his subconscious. And when he woke the next morning, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the only name on his lips was Emily. Ethan woke with a start, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. His dream, vivid and disorienting, lingered at the edges of his mind. He could still hear the distant echoes of a girl's laughter, still feel the warmth of a childhood memory long buried beneath the years. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the early morning light. It was the first word that escaped his lips, and that realization sent a jolt through him. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. He couldn't explain why her name had come so naturally, why it felt like she had been woven into the fabric of his memories, even though they had only just met. The feeling of familiarity was becoming harder to dismiss. Ethan pushed the thoughts aside, struggling to focus on the mundane. His injuries still ached, but the physical pain was manageable compared to the storm brewing in his mind. He couldn't afford to get lost in his thoughts today, not with the business matters Grace had lined up for him. He needed to focus, to be the Ethan Crawford he had always been. In control, detached, driven. But that was easier said than done. When Emily entered his room later that morning, her calm, steady presence seemed to fill the space. She greeted him with the same soft smile she always did, setting about her tasks with quiet efficiency. "Good morning," she said as she opened the curtains, letting sunlight flood the room. "How are you feeling today?" "Fine," Ethan replied, his voice gruff. It was his default response, the one he gave to everyone. But with Emily, it felt like a lie. He wasn't fine. He was confused, restless, and deeply unsettled by the emotions stirring inside him. Emily glanced at him, her hazel eyes catching the light as she studied him for a moment. There was a brief flicker of something in her expression, but she quickly masked it with a professional tone. "You had a rough night?" she asked, noting the tension in his posture. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. He didn't know why he felt compelled to be honest with her, but there was something about Emily that made it difficult to hide behind his usual facade. "Yeah, I couldn't sleep." "I see." Emily moved closer, adjusting the pillows behind him with a gentle touch. "Anything on your mind?" He almost laughed at the simplicity of the question, as if the answer could be wrapped up neatly. "You could say that." For a moment, Emily paused, her hand hovering over his as if she was about to ask more, but then she pulled away, leaving the question hanging in the air between them. "I'll get your breakfast," she said quietly, turning toward the door. But Ethan couldn't let her leave just yet. "Wait." His voice was sharper than he intended, and Emily stopped, turning back to face him. "What is it?" she asked, her tone gentle but wary. He didn't know how to ask what he was thinking without sounding ridiculous. How could he explain that she felt like a ghost from his past, like someone he had lost but never forgotten? And yet, he couldn't ignore it anymore. "Do you ever get the feeling that you've met someone before, even when you're sure you haven't?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for some kind of recognition. Emily blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. She opened her mouth to respond but then hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I think sometimes people can feel familiar because they remind us of something or someone from our past," she said, her voice measured. It's not always easy to explain. Ethan studied her, his mind racing. Was that all this was? Some kind of strange psychological connection? A trick his mind was playing on him because of his current vulnerability? Or was it something more? Emily shifted under his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of his focus. "I'll be right back," she said softly, excusing herself from the room. Ethan leaned back against the pillows, frustration gnawing at him. He wasn't satisfied with her answer. The more time he spent around Emily, the more convinced he became that there was something deeper between them, something neither of them could quite explain. The days continued to pass in a blur, and despite his best efforts, Ethan found himself growing more attached to Emily. She was more than just a caregiver now. She was the person who filled the long, silent hours with conversation, the one who knew how to ease the pain, both physical and emotional, without making him feel weak. Their connection grew naturally, and soon, they began talking more freely. Emily shared small bits about her life, about growing up in foster care after being adopted, about her love for books, and her decision to dedicate herself to caregiving. She was guarded when it came to details, but even the little she shared was more than anyone else in his life had ever told him. For his part, Ethan found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He told her about his childhood, about how his family's wealth had shaped him into the man he was today. Someone who always had to be in control, someone who didn't let people get too close. But Emily somehow was getting close. Too close. One night, after a particularly exhausting day filled with business calls and recovery exercises, Ethan found himself staring out the large window in his bedroom. The city lights in the distance flickered like stars, a world that felt both near and impossibly far away. Emily sat nearby, quietly reading a book, her presence comforting in its simplicity. "I never thought I'd end up here," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Emily looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" "I mean stuck like this, dependent on someone. I built my life on the idea that I wouldn't need anyone," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "And now, I can't even get out of bed on my own." Emily closed her book and stood, moving toward him with a look of understanding. "Needing help doesn't make you weak, Ethan," he scoffed, shaking his head. "It feels like it." Emily's gaze softened. "It's okay to lean on people sometimes. It doesn't make you any less strong. It makes you human." Ethan swallowed, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. "I don't know why you're here," he muttered, his voice quiet, "but I'm glad you are." Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe," she said softly, "we're both here for a reason." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning neither of them fully understood. And as Ethan lay there, watching her retreat into the shadows of the room, the feeling of familiarity surged once more, stronger than ever. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to let her go. The next few days passed in a rhythm that was almost comforting. Ethan and Emily settled into an unspoken routine, one that blurred the lines between patient and caregiver, becoming something deeper, more personal. Yet, beneath the surface, Ethan's mind was anything but calm. That gnawing sensation that Emily was more than just a stranger continued to grow, keeping him awake at night, his thoughts spiraling in a loop that he couldn't escape. It didn't help that the dreams were getting worse. Every night, they returned, vivid, fragmented memories of a childhood he barely remembered. In the dreams, there was always a girl. Her laughter echoed in the distance, her presence felt but never seen clearly. She was a piece of his past, just out of reach, like a shadow he couldn't catch. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Ethan found himself staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the same questions over and over. Who was that girl? Why did he feel like Emily was connected to her in some way? He had asked himself these questions 1,000 times, but the answers remained elusive. His frustration was building, and so was his need for clarity. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were right in front of him, but hidden just out of view. As he lay there, lost in thought, he heard the soft click of the door as Emily entered the room. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly, sensing the tension in the air. Ethan turned his head toward her, his eyes dark with fatigue. "Just thinking," he muttered. "About what?" She pressed gently, moving to sit in the chair beside his bed. He hesitated, unsure of how to put his thoughts into words. "About the past," he said finally. "About things I can't quite remember." Emily's expression softened, her curiosity piqued. "Like what?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been having these dreams. They're strange. It feels like I'm remembering something, but it's all jumbled. There's a girl in them, a girl I knew when I was a kid. I can't see her face, but I know she was important to me." He glanced at Emily, searching her face for any sign of recognition, but she simply listened, her expression unreadable. "Do you remember much about your childhood?" she asked quietly. Ethan frowned, caught off guard by the question. "Not really," he admitted. "My family wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy. We weren't the type to sit around and talk about feelings. Most of my early years are a blur." Emily nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes, memories stay buried for a reason." Her words, though spoken softly, hit him like a weight. He hadn't considered that possibility. Maybe there was a reason he couldn't remember the girl from his dreams. Maybe there was a reason he felt so connected to Emily, even though they had only just met. But what reason could that be? As if sensing his turmoil, Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but steady. "It's okay not to have all the answers right away, Ethan. Some things take time to surface." He looked at her, his chest tightening. There was something about the way she spoke, as if she understood more than she was letting on. As if she, too, was carrying pieces of a past she hadn't yet shared. "Emily," his voice trailed off, unsure of where he was going with the thought. But before he could say more, the moment was interrupted by the sudden sound of his phone buzzing on the table. It was Grace. Ethan grimaced, his focus abruptly pulled back to reality. He reached for the phone, glancing at the message. More business reports, more decisions to make. The weight of his responsibilities felt heavier than usual tonight, and the escape he found in his conversations with Emily slipped away as quickly as it had come. "I should go," Emily said, standing up and smoothing down her scrubs. "You've got work to do." Ethan watched her, a flicker of frustration sparking inside him. He wanted to tell her to stay, to keep talking, to help him untangle the mess of thoughts in his head, but he couldn't find the words. As she turned to leave, he blurted out, "Do you ever feel like you're missing something? Like there's a piece of your life that's just gone?" Emily paused at the doorway, her back to him. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "All the time," she whispered. And with that, she was gone, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy fog. That night, the dreams returned, but this time, they were sharper, more vivid. Ethan was back in his childhood home, a grand, cold mansion filled with expensive furniture and even colder emotions. He was a boy again, running through the halls, searching for something, someone. He could hear her laughter, light and carefree, echoing through the corridors. "Come find me," she called, her voice teasing and familiar. Ethan followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this game. He had played it before. But this time, something felt different. The stakes were higher, the urgency greater. He had to find her. As he rounded a corner, he caught a glimpse of her, just a flash of blonde hair disappearing around the next bend. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he sprinted toward her. But no matter how fast he ran, she was always just out of reach. Then, suddenly, the scene shifted. He was no longer in the mansion. He was outside, standing in a garden he barely recognized. The girl was there, standing in the distance, her back to him. He could see her now, but he still couldn't see her face. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she turned slowly, her face still obscured by shadows. But before Ethan could take a step toward her, the dream shattered, and he woke with a gasp, his heart racing, his body drenched in sweat. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm his breathing. But the dream lingered, as did the feeling that he was missing something crucial, something important, something connected to Emily. The next morning, Ethan was quiet, lost in thought as Emily went about her usual tasks. She could sense the shift in his mood, but she didn't push him. Not today. Instead, they worked in silence, both of them caught in the currents of their own unresolved pasts. But as the day wore on, Ethan's patience with the silence began to wear thin. He needed answers. He needed to understand why Emily felt so familiar, why his dreams were filled with fragments of a forgotten childhood. And he was determined to find out. Ethan's determination grew stronger by the day. The dreams were relentless, becoming more vivid, more insistent. And each time, the girl in his memory felt closer, her presence almost tangible, yet always just out of reach. It was no longer just a passing curiosity. It was a need, a deep-rooted drive to uncover who she was, and why Emily seemed to stir these buried fragments from his past. One afternoon, after hours of restless thoughts and half-finished work, Ethan decided he couldn't wait any longer. There had to be more to this, more than the vague sense of familiarity, more than the fragmented memories that haunted his sleep. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. Reaching for his phone, he called his attorney, Derek Wolfe, a man known for his discretion and ability to uncover information that others might prefer remain hidden. Ethan, Derek's voice came through the line, clipped and professional as always. "What can I do for you?" "I need you to look into someone for me," Ethan said, his voice low as he glanced toward the door, making sure Emily was nowhere within earshot. "Her name is Emily Harper. She's been working as my caregiver for a few weeks now, but I need to know more about her. Where she's from, her past, everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a rustling sound as Derek no doubt began making notes. "Anything in particular you're looking for?" he asked, his tone cautious. Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain what he was really after. How could he tell Derek that he was searching for a connection that felt impossible? That he was trying to piece together fragments of his childhood that might not even exist outside of his dreams? "Just dig up whatever you can," Ethan finally said, pushing down the uncertainty in his chest. "I have a feeling she's connected to something I've forgotten. I don't know how or why, but I need to know." Derek didn't ask any more questions. "I'll look into it and get back to you," he said before ending the call. Ethan sat back in his bed, his mind racing. Now all he could do was wait. And that was the hardest part. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. Ethan continued his physical therapy, Emily remained by his side, and yet the unspoken tension between them seemed to grow. Ethan wanted to ask her directly, to confront her about the strange familiarity he couldn't shake. But every time he opened his mouth to speak, the words died on his lips. He didn't know how to ask without sounding irrational, without scaring her away. And so, the silence between them stretched longer, heavier. Then, one evening, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Derek. "Ethan, I found something you need to hear," Derek said, his voice steady, though Ethan could sense the weight behind his words. "What is it?" Ethan asked, gripping the phone tightly, his heart racing. "I looked into Emily's past like you asked. It turns out she was adopted as a child," Derek explained, his tone cautious. "Her birth family, they abandoned her when she was very young. She's been in and out of foster care before eventually being adopted by a family in another state." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form, but they were far from clear. "Do you know anything about her birth family?" Ethan pressed, his voice tight with anticipation. "That's where things get interesting," Derek replied. "The records are sealed, but from what I could gather, it seems her birth family was wealthy, and local. It's possible they had connections, enough to keep this quiet." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened as Derek continued, the implications of his words sinking in. "Are you saying her family could have been mine?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek paused for a moment, then answered carefully. "It's a possibility, Ethan. I can't say for sure yet, but from what I've found, it's not out of the realm of possibility." The room seemed to spin around Ethan as he processed the information. The girl from his dreams, the one he had been chasing through the corridors of his mind, Was it Emily? Had she been a part of his life, only to be erased from it without him even knowing? "I'll keep digging," Derek said after a moment. "But I thought you should know what I've found so far." Ethan barely registered his response, the phone slipping from his grasp as the weight of the revelation hit him. Could it be true? Could Emily be the girl he had forgotten? The missing piece of his childhood? Suddenly, everything made sense. The strange connection he felt to her. The way her presence stirred up memories he hadn't thought about in years. But if it was true, if she really was his sister, then everything between them would change. Everything. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, doubts, and the growing realization that his past was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. He needed to confront Emily, to ask her about her past, to find out if she knew anything about the family that had abandoned her. But the fear of what he might discover kept him rooted in place, torn between the need for answers and the fear of the truth. The next morning, Ethan woke with a renewed sense of determination. He couldn't put this off any longer. He had to know. As Emily entered the room to help him with his morning routine, Ethan watched her closely, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily," he began, his voice more strained than he intended. "Can we talk for a minute?" She looked up at him, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "Of course," she said, setting down the tray of medications she had been preparing. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. How could he ask this without sounding insane, without appending everything they had built between them? But there was no other way. I asked someone to look into your past," Ethan said slowly, watching her expression shift from curiosity to confusion. "I needed to know more about you, about where you came from." Emily's brow furrowed, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed his words. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with unease. "Because I've been having these dreams," Ethan admitted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Dreams about a girl from my past, someone I can't quite remember, but who feels important. And ever since you came into my life, I can't shake the feeling that you're connected to her somehow." Emily's eyes widened, her face paling as she took a step back. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" "I found out you were adopted," he said, his voice trembling, "and that your birth family, well, there's a chance they were mine." For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Emily stood frozen, her eyes locked on his, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then, slowly, she shook her head, as if trying to make sense of what he was saying. "That can't be true," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It can't be." But the look in her eyes told him that, deep down, she knew. She had always known, even if she hadn't let herself believe it. "Emily," Ethan said softly, reaching out toward her, "we need to find out. We need to know the truth." Emily stared at him, her eyes filling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. And in that moment, everything between them shifted. The unspoken connection they had shared, the bond that had grown between them, it all took on a new, painful meaning. Because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, had finally begun to surface. The silence between them felt like a physical weight, pressing down on Ethan as he watched Emily's reaction. Her face was a mask of confusion and denial, but beneath the surface, he could see the truth beginning to crack through. The room, once filled with the mundane routines of caregiving, now felt like the setting of a storm about to break. Emily took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. "Ethan, I don't know where you're getting this from, but it can't be true. I've never known anything about my birth family." She stopped herself, her eyes darting toward the window, as if looking for an escape. But Ethan didn't back down. He couldn't. "Not now. I know it sounds insane," he admitted, his voice quieter but no less urgent. "But I've had these memories, these dreams ever since you got here. I don't think it's a coincidence." Emily shook her head, the disbelief still evident in her eyes, but something in her posture had shifted. "I don't remember anything from before I was adopted," she said, her voice shaky. "I was too young. But you're telling me you think I'm, what? Someone you knew? Someone from your past?" "Someone I lost," Ethan whispered. "Someone my family, Someone they kept hidden? The weight of the words lingered between them, too heavy to dismiss. Emily swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. Why would they do that? She asked, the disbelief still fighting to stay in control. Why would anyone keep something like this a secret? Ethan's jaw tightened as he thought of the life he'd grown up in, the cold, unyielding expectations of his family. He didn't want to believe it either, but the more he uncovered, the more he realized how deep the lies must have gone. I don't know, he admitted, but my family, they had a way of controlling everything. I never asked questions, but I think my mother might know more than she's ever told me. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, her eyes wide. You want to ask her? I have to, Ethan said firmly, his gaze steady. There's no other way to know for sure. Emily didn't respond right away. She looked torn between wanting to run from this impossible revelation and the quiet yearning for answers that had always lingered in her eyes. Ethan could see it, that same need he had. The need to know where she came from, to fill the empty spaces in her life that had never made sense. Finally, Emily nodded, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Okay. The following day, Ethan arranged for his mother, Margaret Crawford, to come to the mansion. It had been weeks since she'd last visited, her concern for his recovery often expressed through distant phone calls and brief messages. She was a woman who had always valued appearances, and to her, weakness, whether physical or emotional, was something to be handled discreetly, never displayed. When Margaret arrived, she was her usual composed self. Her graying hair was styled perfectly, her movements elegant as she stepped into the room. Ethan, she greeted, her voice warm but guarded. You look well. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. His eyes locked onto his mother's, and he could see the surprise flicker in her gaze when she realized this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Mother, we need to talk, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but Ethan knew her well enough to sense the shift in her demeanor. Of course, she replied smoothly, settling into a chair across from him. What is this about? Ethan glanced at Emily, who stood at the edge of the room, her posture tense. His mother followed his gaze, her brow furrowing slightly as she took in Emily's presence. This is Emily, Ethan said, his voice steady. She's been helping with my recovery. Margaret offered a polite nod, though her attention remained on Ethan. Yes, I've heard. Grace mentioned her. Ethan took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. I found out something recently, he began, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. Something about Emily. Margaret's expression didn't falter, but there was a subtle stiffening in her posture. What do you mean? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed forward. Emily was adopted as a child, he said quietly, and I think she might be someone from our family. For the first time, a crack appeared in Margaret's composure. Her eyes darted between Ethan and Emily, her carefully maintained facade slipping. Ethan, that's impossible, she said, her voice sharp. Where did you hear such a thing? I asked someone to look into it, Ethan replied. There are records, sealed records. Emily's birth family was wealthy, local, and I've been having memories, Mother. Memories of a girl I used to know. A girl who was suddenly gone. Margaret's face paled, her usual grace replaced by a look of barely concealed panic. Ethan, you don't know what you're talking about. Those memories, they're just dreams. Ethan leaned forward, his voice firm. They're not just dreams. I need to know the truth. Is Emily my sister? The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and undeniable. Margaret's eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Something darker, something she had kept hidden for years. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she stood abruptly, turning away from him as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. Mother, Ethan said, his voice harder now, you can't hide this anymore. For a long, agonizing moment, Margaret remained silent, her back turned to them. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. The single word shattered everything. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the world seemed to tilt around him. He glanced at Emily, who stood frozen in shock, her face pale as the truth washed over her. Margaret turned slowly, her expression one of defeat. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. I had no choice. We had no choice." "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "How could you keep this from me?" From her? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in his life, Ethan saw her as vulnerable. "It was complicated," she said, her voice breaking. "Your father, he had an affair. Emily is the result of that affair. I didn't know what to do, Ethan. I was trying to protect you, protect our family." The air in the room was thick with the weight of the confession. Emily stood motionless, her entire world collapsing around her. She had spent her life searching for answers, and now that she had them, they were more painful than she could have ever imagined. "I gave her up," Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face. "I thought it was the only way. I thought it would be better for everyone." Ethan's chest tightened with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You lied to us," he said, his voice barely controlled. "You let us live our whole lives without knowing each other." "I was trying to protect you," Margaret whispered, her voice pleading. "I didn't want you to hate me." Ethan stared at his mother, his emotions a tangled mess of betrayal and sadness. He glanced at Emily, who stood silently, her expression one of disbelief and quiet devastation. For a moment, no one spoke. The truth, now laid bare, hung between them, too heavy to ignore. And Ethan realized, with a deep sense of sorrow, that nothing would ever be the same again. The revelation shattered the fragile silence that had settled in the room. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process the weight of his mother's confession. His entire life had been built on half-truths, on a family image meticulously maintained, and now it was all unraveling before him. Across the room, Emily's face remained frozen in shock, the reality of her past hanging between them like a jagged blade. Margaret's words still echoed in the air, each one landing like a fresh blow. "I gave her up. I thought it was the only way." The truth felt heavier than any burden Ethan had carried before. He had spent his life believing he knew who he was, who his family was. But now, with a few words, everything had changed. Ethan took a shaky breath, his gaze shifting to Emily. She hadn't moved since the confession, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if trying to grasp the enormity of it all. Her hands, once steady and comforting, trembled at her sides. "Emily!" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it broke through the oppressive silence. She blinked, her eyes finally meeting his, and for the first time, Ethan saw the cracks forming in her composure. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice raw with disbelief. I don't even know you. How could this be true?" The pain in her voice was palpable, and it tore at Ethan's heart. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer some kind of comfort, but what could he say? What could he possibly do to ease the weight of the truth that had been thrust upon them both? "I didn't know either," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "I swear, Emily, I didn't know." Emily's eyes flickered with emotion, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts as she tried to make sense of everything. "All this time," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. I thought I was just someone no one wanted. I never imagined," her voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The room felt too small, the air too thick with the tension of everything unsaid. Ethan's heart ached for her, for the years she had spent alone, wondering where she came from, searching for answers that had been kept from her. He couldn't imagine the pain she must have endured, the loneliness. Margaret stood off to the side, her face pale and drawn, her usual steely composure completely shattered. For the first time in Ethan's life, his mother looked broken, vulnerable. But the anger inside him still burned, fierce and hot. "How could you do this?" Ethan's voice was tight, barely controlled. He turned to face Margaret, his eyes filled with the betrayal he felt. "How could you lie to us?" "To me?" Margaret's lip trembled, but she didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, Her voice was small, as if the confession had drained all her strength. "I was trying to protect you," she whispered, repeating the same words as before. "Your father, his affair, it would have destroyed everything. Our family, your future. I did what I thought was right." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the anger bubbling up again. "You were protecting yourself," he said, his voice cold. "You didn't think about what this would do to us." To her. Margaret flinched, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth she had hidden for so long. "I didn't know it would turn out like this," she said, tears welling in her eyes. I thought I was saving our family from falling apart. I didn't want you to grow up in a broken home. Instead, you made sure we were broken from the start," Ethan said bitterly, his voice filled with hurt. He turned away from his mother, unable to look at her anymore, and focused on Emily instead. Emily, who had been abandoned, lied to, left to navigate life without the family that should have been hers. His sister. The word still felt foreign in his mind, but the bond between them, the connection he had felt from the beginning, now made sense in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. "Emily," Ethan said again, his voice softer now, pleading, "Please talk to me." But Emily shook her head, stepping back as if the distance between them might make the truth easier to bear. I don't know how to process this, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know what to do with any of this." Ethan's chest tightened. "We can figure it out together," he urged, desperate to hold on to the fragile connection they had. "We'll get through this, Emily. I promise." Emily's eyes were filled with pain, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might listen. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head again, more firmly this time. "I don't know if I can stay here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can handle this." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and Ethan's heart clenched with a mixture of fear and helplessness. "Please don't go," he said, his voice raw. "Not like this. We just found out the truth, Emily. Don't walk away now." But Emily's face was filled with uncertainty, her eyes distant as if she were already pulling away. "I need time, Ethan," she said, her voice barely steady. "I need time to figure out who I am, what all of this means." Ethan felt a sinking feeling in his chest as he realized he couldn't stop her. As much as he wanted to fix this, to make everything right, the truth was too fresh, too raw. And Emily needed space. Space to grieve, to process, to decide what came next for her. "I understand," Ethan said softly, though the words felt like they were tearing him apart. "But please, just know that I'm here. I'll be here when you're ready." Emily gave him a small, sad smile, but the distance in her eyes remained. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Later that evening, the house was eerily quiet. The weight of the truth had settled over everything, and Ethan felt its suffocating grip as he sat alone in his room, staring blankly at the ceiling. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories of his childhood, fragments of the dreams that had plagued him, and the image of Emily walking away, her face filled with pain. He had lost her. He had just found out she was his sister, and already, she was slipping away. The sound of a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and Ethan looked up to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't respond right away, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. But after a long moment, he nodded. "Fine." Margaret stepped into the room, her movements slow, as if the weight of her confession had drained her of all energy. She sat down in the chair across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice filled with regret. "I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and I don't expect you to forgive me." Ethan stared at her, his emotions a tangled mess of hurt, anger, and confusion. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why didn't you give her a chance?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I was scared," she admitted. "I was scared of losing everything. I didn't know how to handle what your father had done. I didn't want you to grow up resenting me, or her." Well, congratulations, Ethan said bitterly. You managed to make sure we both resent you. Margaret flinched, and for a moment, Ethan felt a pang of guilt. But the anger was still too strong, too fresh. I know I can't fix this, Margaret said, her voice trembling, but I want to try. I want to make things right, if that's even possible. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his gaze focused on the floor. He wasn't sure if things could ever be made right, not after all the lies. But one thing was clear. The truth had finally come out. And now, it was up to them, all of them, to decide what came next. Days passed in a fog of uncertainty. Ethan barely left the mansion, his mind consumed with thoughts of Emily and the shattered remains of their family's past. Each day without hearing from her felt like a wound that refused to heal. He replayed their last conversation over and over in his mind. The pain in her voice, the confusion in her eyes as she walked away, needing time, space, distance. And it was that distance that hurt the most. He was so used to being in control, managing crises in the business world with a cold efficiency. But this was different. This was personal, raw, and it gnawed at him in a way that no corporate challenge ever had. The ache of losing Emily before he'd really gotten the chance to know her was unbearable, but he knew he couldn't push her. She had every right to take her time to process everything, just as he did. Still, the waiting was a slow, agonizing torture. One morning, as Ethan sat staring at his phone, hoping for some message, a sign that she was ready to talk, Grace entered his study. Her expression was careful, as though she could sense the storm of emotions just beneath the surface. "Any word?" she asked gently, her voice barely interrupting the heavy silence in the room. Ethan shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. He didn't want to admit how desperate he was for news, how much it hurt to be left in this limbo. Grace sighed, taking a seat across from him. "She's probably just trying to figure things out. It's a lot to take in." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice thick. "I just don't know how to fix this. I don't know if it can be fixed." Grace studied him for a moment before leaning forward slightly. "I've known you a long time, Ethan. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't give up easily. You and Emily, you have a connection. It's undeniable. But you need to give her time to understand what that means, to her and to you." Ethan rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "I feel like I've already lost her." "You haven't," Grace said firmly. "But if you push too hard, too fast, you might." Ethan nodded, knowing she was right. He hated feeling powerless, hated that there was nothing he could do but wait. But Grace's words rang true. If he forced the issue, if he tried to pull Emily back before she was ready, it could ruin whatever fragile bond remained between them. As the days stretched on, Ethan buried himself in work. It was the only way he knew how to cope, the only way to silence the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He threw himself into meetings, strategy sessions, anything to distract himself from the gaping hole that Emily had left behind. But no matter how hard he tried, she was always there, lingering in the back of his mind. And then, one evening, as Ethan sat in his study reviewing the day's reports, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. His heart raced as he unlocked the screen, scanning the words quickly, his breath catching in his throat. "Can we meet? I think we need to talk." For a moment, Ethan just stared at the screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. She wanted to talk. After all the silence, all the distance, she was ready. His hands shook as he typed a reply, keeping it short, simple. "Of course. When and where?" Her response came quickly. "Tomorrow. The park by the lake. 2 p.m. Ethan's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. But as the initial rush of excitement faded, anxiety began to creep in. What if this conversation didn't go the way he hoped? What if she'd made up her mind to walk away for good? The next day, the park by the lake was quiet, the autumn leaves drifting gently in the breeze. Ethan arrived early, his nerves coiled tight as he waited. He paced by the water's edge, watching the ripples break across the surface, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them settling. At exactly 2 p.m., he saw her. Emily was walking toward him, Her face set in a neutral expression, but there was something softer in her eyes, something more open than the last time they had spoken. Ethan's heart pounded as she approached, every step bringing them closer to the conversation he wasn't sure he was ready for. "Hi," she said quietly, stopping a few feet away from him. "Hi," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though the tension in his chest was almost unbearable. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." Emily nodded, glancing toward the lake. "I needed time to think." "I understand," Ethan said quickly. "I didn't want to push you." She looked at him then, her gaze searching his face as if trying to find something. Maybe the brother she hadn't known she had. Maybe the man she'd started to care for in ways that complicated everything. Ethan couldn't be sure, but the intensity of her look was enough to make his pulse quicken. "I've been thinking a lot," Emily said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "About everything. About what this all means. And I don't have all the answers yet." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. "I don't either, but I want to figure it out. Together." Emily sighed, her expression softening. "It's not that simple, Ethan. We can't just pretend like this is something we can easily work through." "I know it's complicated," he said, stepping closer, his voice filled with quiet urgency. "But we've already lost so much time. I don't want to lose you again." Her eyes flickered with emotion, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might walk away. But then she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I don't want that either," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared. I don't know how to move forward from here." "We can take it one step at a time," Ethan said softly, his gaze locked on hers. "I'm not asking for everything to be fixed overnight, but I don't want to walk away from this. From you." Emily's eyes filled with unshed tears, and she looked away, as if trying to regain control of her emotions. "I spent my whole life wondering where I came from," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd find the answers. And now that I have, it's overwhelming. I'm not just someone's lost child. I'm your sister. And that changes everything." Ethan's chest tightened, but he reached for her hand, gently clasping it between his own. "It does change things," he agreed. "But it doesn't have to break us. We can figure this out, Emily. Together." For a long, agonizing moment, Emily remained still, her hand trembling in his. Then, slowly, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a tentative hope that made Ethan's heart swell. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll figure it out. Together." Relief surged through him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to breathe again. It wasn't going to be easy, and the path ahead was still uncertain, but for now, it was enough. They had each other, and that was the first step. The decision to face their new reality together had given Ethan and Emily a glimmer of hope, but the journey ahead was far from simple. The days following their meeting by the lake were filled with cautious attempts at rebuilding the fragile connection between them. There was an unspoken understanding now, a shared history that neither of them had known about, but one they had to face, no matter how painful. Ethan tried to keep things light, at least in the beginning. He focused on the simple moments, offering Emily a glimpse into his life in a way that wasn't overwhelming. He showed her around the mansion, revealing bits of their shared childhood home that she had never known existed. The grand hallways, the old family portraits that now carried new weight, the places where he used to play, where, perhaps, she should have been too. Emily absorbed it all with a quiet intensity, her emotions carefully guarded. It was a lot to take in, and Ethan could sense the strain it put on her. She would often pause, staring at something from their past, a faded picture, an old toy, a forgotten piece of their family's history, and Ethan could see the weight of what could have been flickering in her eyes. One afternoon, they sat in the living room, the sun casting long shadows across the floor as the quiet settled between them. Emily was looking at a photograph of their parents, taken long before the weight of their father's affair had come crashing down on their family. It was a picture of a life that neither of them had fully known, and for Emily, it must have been like looking at strangers. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her, his heart heavy. "All the time," he admitted. "I wonder what kind of relationship we would have had if none of this had happened. If we'd grown up together." Emily nodded, her gaze still fixed on the photograph. I used to imagine what my birth family was like. I'd create stories in my head about them, you know? Sometimes, they were these perfect, loving people who would come back for me one day. Other times, I'd convince myself they didn't care, that I was better off without them. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly. But this is different. I didn't expect it to feel this complicated. Ethan felt a pang of guilt, the weight of her words sinking deep. I wish I could change things, he said softly. I wish you didn't have to go through this, that we didn't have to find out this way. Emily gave a small, sad smile. It's not your fault, Ethan. We're just trying to figure out how to move forward. There was a long pause, and then she turned to him, her expression conflicted. I know I said I wanted to figure this out together, but I'm still scared. I'm scared that this will always be hanging over us, that we'll never be able to be normal. Ethan's chest tightened at the vulnerability in her voice. I'm scared too, he admitted, his voice quiet. But I think the fact that we're both willing to try, that we want to figure it out, means we're already on the right path. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. You really believe that? I do, Ethan said firmly. We didn't choose any of this, Emily, but we can choose how we deal with it. Emily was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the truth in his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, one step at a time. As they began taking those steps, there were moments of progress and moments of setback. The deeper they delved into their shared history, the more difficult it became to navigate the emotional landmines that had been left in their wake. Ethan found himself struggling with the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. The betrayal of his mother's lies, the years he had spent without knowing his sister, and the deep, unresolved feelings he had for Emily that had now transformed into something entirely new and complicated. But it was harder for Emily. The emotions she had suppressed for years were bubbling to the surface in ways she hadn't anticipated. The discovery of her real family was a revelation she had longed for, but it was also a painful reminder of the life she had never had. There were days when she withdrew, the weight of it all pressing too hard on her chest, and Ethan could only watch, helpless, as she retreated into herself. One evening, as Ethan sat in his study, reviewing work to distract himself from the overwhelming emotions, he heard a soft knock at the door. He looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice tentative. Ethan nodded, setting aside the papers. "Of course." She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the walls lined with books and the faintly glowing fireplace. For a moment, she didn't speak, just stood there, as if gathering her thoughts. Finally, she looked at him, her face etched with uncertainty. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice soft. "About us. About this new reality." Ethan's heart pounded as he braced himself for whatever was coming next. "I'm grateful for the chance to get to know you," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "But I'm also struggling. I don't know how to balance what I feel. The part of me that's always wanted to find my family and the part of me that's terrified of what that really means." "I get that," Ethan said, his voice thick. "It's been a lot for both of us. But I want you to know that whatever you're feeling, it's okay. We'll figure it out together, no matter how messy it gets." Emily nodded, but her expression remained conflicted. I need to know if we can really do this. If we can build a relationship that isn't weighed down by the past." Ethan stood and crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. He looked into her eyes, his heart aching for the pain he saw there. "I think it's going to take time. And it's going to be hard," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I don't want to lose you again, Emily. I can't." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you either. But I don't know if I can handle this. I don't know if I can live with the shadow of our past hanging over us." Ethan reached for her hand, gently pulling her closer. "We can't change the past," he said softly, "but we can make something out of what we have now. You're not alone anymore, Emily. You don't have to carry this by yourself." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she hesitated, as if standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump. But then, slowly, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, the tension in her body finally easing. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his heart heavy but determined. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step. One step toward healing. One step toward finding the family they had both been missing. As they stood there, the quiet enveloping them, Ethan realized that this was what family was. Not just the blood that tied them together, but the choice to stay, to fight, to heal. Together. The days that followed were filled with tentative steps toward a new normal. There was still tension, moments where the past seemed too heavy to bear, but for the first time, Ethan and Emily were learning how to lean on each other. The bond they had started to build felt fragile, but it was there, growing stronger with every shared conversation, every vulnerable moment where they let their walls down. Ethan found himself growing more protective of Emily, not in the way he had before when he thought of her as simply someone he cared for deeply, but now as family. Someone who had been lost to him for so long, but was now his responsibility in a way he had never imagined. And while that responsibility came with its own set of complications, Ethan welcomed it. He wanted to be the brother she never had, to be the one to help her find the sense of belonging that had been missing from her life. Emily, for her part, was beginning to open up more. Slowly, she shared pieces of her life with Ethan that she had kept hidden before. Stories of her childhood and foster care, the families that had taken her in but never really made her feel like she was part of them. There was pain in those memories, but there was also resilience, and Ethan admired her even more for it. One evening, they sat together in the mansion's library, a space Ethan had always considered a sanctuary but that now felt like something more. Emily was curled up on the couch, a book in her lap, though she wasn't really reading. Instead, she stared at the crackling fire, lost in thought. Ethan sat across from her, his own thoughts swirling as he watched her. "Do you ever regret it?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice soft but steady. "Finding out the truth?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the question. He leaned forward slightly, considering his answer. "No," he said after a moment. "It's been hard, complicated, but I don't regret knowing. I don't regret finding you." Emily's lips quirked into a small, almost wistful smile, though her eyes remained distant. "I'm not sure what to do with all of this sometimes," she admitted. "I spent so many years imagining what it would be like to find my family, and now that I have, it's nothing like I thought it would be." Ethan understood that feeling all too well. He had never imagined that discovering the truth would come with so many emotional hurdles. But despite the challenges, he couldn't deny how grateful he was to have Emily in his life. "We'll figure it out," he said, echoing the words he had spoken to her so many times. "One step at a time, right?" Emily chuckled softly, shaking her head. "You're really holding on to that, huh?" "It's the only thing that makes sense right now," Ethan said, his tone light but earnest. "We can't fix everything overnight, but we're trying. That's what matters." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, its warmth filling the room as they sat in companionable quiet. There was still so much they had to face, so many unanswered questions about their family's past, but for now, they were just two people learning how to be siblings, learning how to heal. "Do you ever think about confronting your mother again?" Emily asked quietly, her eyes flickering toward him. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. Margaret's confession still weighed heavily on his mind, but the anger that had once burned so fiercely was beginning to cool. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to ask her why she kept this secret for so long. But another part of me just wants to move on." Emily nodded, understanding. She must have her reasons, as twisted as they might be. "She does," Ethan agreed, though it didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. "But I can't let her choices dictate the rest of my life. We've already lost so much time. I don't want to waste any more of it." Emily looked at him, her expression softening. "I don't want to waste time either. I've spent too many years looking back, wondering what I could have had. But now, I'm here. We're here. And that's what matters." Ethan smiled at her, a sense of peace settling in his chest. They had come so far in such a short amount of time, but they had a long way to go. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but they were no longer facing it alone. In the following weeks, They took those small steps, navigating the complexities of their newfound relationship. Ethan introduced Emily to parts of their family history she had never known. Not the curated version their mother had presented to the world, but the real stories, the moments of love and loss that had shaped who they were. They shared memories, not of a shared childhood, but of the lives they had lived separately, learning more about each other in ways that felt natural, not forced. There were moments of laughter, moments where the weight of their past seemed to lift, allowing them to just be themselves. But there were also moments of tension, times when the gravity of their situation would return, reminding them that healing wasn't linear. Ethan knew that it would take time for them to truly understand what it meant to be family after everything they had been through. One afternoon, they visited the small garden on the estate, a quiet place that Ethan had often retreated to during his recovery. It was peaceful here, away from the weight of the mansion and the memories it held. As they walked, Emily stopped by a large oak tree, her hand resting lightly on the rough bark. "Do you ever wonder if things would have been better if we never found out?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan considered her question, then shook his head. "No," he said firmly, "because even though this has been hard, it's given us a chance to know each other, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." Emily looked at him, her expression contemplative, then nodded. "Yeah," she said quietly, "I wouldn't either." They stood there for a while, the breeze rustling the leaves above them, the future still uncertain, but no longer as terrifying as it once had been. They had each other now, a brother and a sister who had been kept apart but had found their way back together, against all odds. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the garden, Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. There would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what the future held. He and Emily had faced the truth, and together, they would face whatever came next. For the first time, they weren't running from the past. They were walking toward the future, side by side.